Good afternoon, everyone. It's good of you to come to this last joint seminar of the term, and in fact of the academic year, when you could be outside where it's nice right now. Today's speaker is David Grinspoon, who is the Curator of Astrobiology at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and Adjunct Professor of Astrophysical and Planetary Science at the University of Colorado. He's also a consultant to NASA and the European Space Agency. His papers have been published in Nature, Science, among other journals. And his latest book, Lonely Planet, The Natural Philosophy of Alien Life, won a PEN Literary Award for Research Nonfiction. His writings have appeared in Scientific American, Natural History, Astronomy, the Boston Globe, the Los Angeles Times, and the New York Times. Dr. Grinspoon has appeared on TV and radio shows, and he was awarded the 2006 Carl Sagan Medal for Public Communication of Planetary Science by the American Astronomical Society. He holds degrees in Philosophy of Science and Planetary Science from Brown University, and a doctorate in Planetary Science from the University of Arizona. Please welcome David Grinspoon.
All right, thanks a lot for coming out this afternoon. It's actually my first time here at Dartmouth, which is kind of ridiculous since I grew up and was educated in New England, and I had a lot of friends and colleagues at Dartmouth, so I'm pleased to finally make it here, and it's especially on a lovely spring day like this. And as I was driving up through the beautiful, lush New England forest, it was very, very clear to me that, especially compared to my home biome in the high desert of Colorado, that this place is absolutely full of life. And I can say that confidently, even though I can't say what life is. I still have no doubt. So I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here. The first 50 years of the space age have yielded a tremendous harvest of knowledge, information, perspective, maybe even wisdom, who knows, for us about our place in the universe, and given us some ability to start to Hey, Pluto, get out of there. This is a family portrait of the solar system, and we can argue a little bit about who belongs in the picture, but basically this is what we are able to do now, which we weren't able to do 50 years ago, which is look at the planets of our solar system as a family, look at our sibling worlds, including our own Earth, and get some context, do some comparisons, and get out of the box of just being completely stuck on one planet, and start to think about planets and the phenomena that occur on them in a slightly more global, less parochial way, if you will. And this exploration, which I think, hopefully, I feel we are just starting, has been driven, at least in part, perhaps quite centrally, by the question of whether life is one of those phenomena just restricted to Earth or something that exists more broadly in the universe. So not the only reason, but a major reason why we explore the solar system and why we're starting to do what we can to explore planets beyond the solar system is to answer the question of whether we can find life out there, whether we're alone. But of course, we have a problem in that we don't really know how to define life. And there is this sort of philosophical solipsistic paradox in that we only have one example of life. I was recently at a symposium on diversity, and people were talking about all the tremendous biodiversity, which of course there is on Earth. And yet on a certain level, in a certain way, there's no biodiversity. We have one example of life. all life on Earth works the same way in a very profound biochemical level. All life on Earth, as far as we can tell, and we can tell pretty far with modern microbiological tools, is closely related. So we have one origin of life that survives, one example of life. So the true biodiversity in the cosmic sense of our universe is unknown to us. And it's a really interesting question on some of those biochemical, microbiological, cellular, functional levels, what we may have in common with extraterrestrial life. We want to know, and so we explore, but what are we looking for? It's a very strange thing to be searching for something which you can't define. That's what we're doing. Now, of course, Star Trek, without which certainly I, perhaps some of you might not be here, they had a handy solution to this. Mr. Spock is holding a tricorder. A tricorder, you could point at something and say, there are life signs, or, Captain, we are not reading any life signs. Even from orbit, you could do this. Now, that was pretty cool. That's what we want. My good friend and colleague, Chris McKay, wrote a great paper on this topic of what is life a few years ago, and the first sentence of that paper was, I need a tricorder. That's what we want, but we don't know how to design one, even if we, well, first of all, we don't completely know what life is, and that would be a good starting point for designing a device that could search for life signs. So in the meantime, without a tricorder, we muddle through. Whoops, there goes Pluto again. So what is life? There have been several attempts to answer this question, and I'll lead you briefly through some ideas that come out of this history. One could easily spend this whole lecture going into the semantic and philosophical problems that one encounters in trying to do this exercise, and I'm going to skim through that because we don't want to spend the entire time talking about definitions. But a famous example of, and one of the first modern approaches to this question was the famous physicist Schrodinger, who wrote a book in 1943 entitled What is Life? And Schrodinger suggested that the key aspect of life that distinguishes it from non-living entities is that life is negative entropy. In other words, it's mysterious order in seeming defiance of the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy always increases. And in any closed system, entropy does increase, and life does not violate that. However, life is an open system and can locally it's a phenomenon that produces remarkable order. Now, so Schrodinger suggested the characteristic feature of life is its ability to exist in improbable states. Now that is true. You can't find an example of life that doesn't fit that criteria. The problem is it's not necessarily enough to be strictly useful to us because, first of all, it's vague. What makes something improbable enough to be alive? And secondly, there are phenomena we find in nature, certain kinds of what now are called dissipative structures that show a great deal of order and exist in improbable states that are otherwise things that we would probably not consider alive. Certain kinds of, for instance, crystal structures are highly ordered and perhaps somewhat improbable. So what else makes life different from non-life? Well, life involves reproduction, obviously. And yet, of course, there are famously exceptions to this criteria, or things that we would consider non-living. There are certain kinds of chemical reactions that reproduce themselves, and the famous exception to a lot of definitions is fire. Fire is a chemical structure that reproduces itself, and yet I think most of us would agree that a fire is not alive. Why not? Well, it doesn't have heredity. Life has been more recently defined as negative entropy, or a structure with negative entropy, a process with negative entropy that not only reproduces but evolves. is able to make some kind of adaptation to its environment and pass along that adaptation to further generations, further products of that reproductive process. So you need some form of heredity, some physical mechanism that leads to, in a sense, a kind of memory of adaptation, and fires don't do that. So we can go on and on. There are other kinds of definitions. People have used the theory of cybernetics in terms of different kinds of positive and negative feedbacks and come up with cybernetic definitions. There are other kinds of definitions where people have given up on simple sort of phrases, philosophically tight definitions, and produce sort of lists. There are list definitions of all the different characteristics, reproduction. They usually involve some kind of containment or vessel or membranes differentiating the interior of an organism from the rest, from its exterior, an ability to control its own environment, homeostasis. One can come up with a pretty good list and say that living things generally meet the criteria of this list. In terms of a tidy, succinctly stated definition, I think about the best we can do at this point is something like this: a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. And again, it's not a perfect definition, and there are exceptions, and borderline cases. Of virus is a famous borderline case. I don't want to go there now because we could spend the whole time arguing about viruses, which people love to do. Are they dead or alive? They have some of the qualities, but they don't have their own metabolism. A virus depends on other living organisms to survive. So is it alive? Perhaps not. But then one can say that, I think, about all living organisms. Take a human being, remove them from the earth, put them out in the universe somewhere, and they're not really going to survive any more than a virus will outside of a cell. So are we alive? Well, it depends on the context, right? So it's tricky. And maybe it doesn't matter, really. But I'll return to that question of whether it matters in a moment. But you know, this is not a bad working definition. At least we have a working definition that I think we can reasonably agree applies to most instances of what we could consider life in a useful sense. The useful sense aiding us in looking for it elsewhere. Even if it's not philosophically ironclad, it's good enough that we can use it. And then there's the subset of life, perhaps, that is life as we know it. That is life that works the way that we work, biochemically, which is made of organic molecules dissolved in water. And other kinds of life certainly may be possible. There's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of literature about whether they are, but most discussions of searching for life in the universe assume you need organic molecules in liquid water. Is that a good assumption? I'm not sure, but it's a pragmatic assumption. We know that carbon in water life works. We have reason to believe these materials and conditions should exist elsewhere. So it gives us a place to start. It's something we can look for elsewhere in the universe, even while we must remain open to the possibility that there may be other kinds of life that don't fit this life as we know it criteria. Now, there's also the interesting question of, does life elsewhere have to be Darwinian, and what do we mean by that? Well, Darwin is quite popular among scientists. He's got a Facebook page. He's hip. You know, Darwin, among scientists and those of us involved in science education, I think particularly, is kind of sacrosanct, especially because evolution and Darwinian ideas have been sort of under attack. We tend to respond to that by putting him on a pedestal, and you know, I'm not going to try to take Chuck D down a few notches. He's he's my main man. But one could not know anything about the history of science without having incredible admiration for what the gaining the perspective of Darwinian evolution has given us as a species, as a scientific culture. It's the basis for our biology, for our understanding of so much of the world we live in. And yet it is interesting to wonder, does life have to be Darwinian? Are there any reasonable alternatives? What do we mean by Darwinian anyways. Well, what I mean is evolving through Darwinian mechanisms, evolution through natural selection. And this is a hard thing to argue against because it doesn't depend on anything except for sort of basic logic, sort of mathematical, physical logic. If you have any system of heredity with variation, you're going to get Darwinian evolution because variation will give you a non-uniform survival rate. So just randomly, some things will reproduce themselves better than others. And that fitness defined that way, it just, clearly there will be a range of fitness, and heredity allows those improvements in fitness for whatever reason to be propagated to future generations. So Darwinian evolution will happen on any planet, any environment with a system of heredity that doesn't just make complete, perfect carbon copies of itself. It can't not happen. So are there any reasonable alternatives? Well, it's interesting. If you look historically, there was a competing idea for a while, an important one developed by this guy, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Now, he's not quite as popular as Darwin, but he's an important figure. He was an early proponent of a lot of the same ideas that Darwin is known famously as a proponent of, the idea that evolution occurred and proceeded in accordance with natural laws. And his theory is sort of summarized, the way Darwin's is summarized as natural selection. Lamarck's idea is summarized as the inheritance of acquired characteristics. That is, that things that happened to an individual over their lifetime can somehow, changes that occur to one's experience can be propagated, passed on to one's offspring. Now, of course, in Darwinian evolution, it doesn't work that way. The genes you're born with are the genes you pass on, except for maybe some random mutation, but your life experience, the things that you gain or lose during your lifetime, that doesn't matter to your offspring. Lamarck said, well, for instance, if there's a giraffe and it's straining to reach these high branches, then the use of that part of the body means that that enhanced need for a longer neck will be passed on to future generations. It's an acquired characteristic. Now, it's interesting. There's nothing necessarily illogic about this system. Before we knew how life worked on the inside, on the molecular or genetic level, this was a reasonable alternative to Darwinism. It wasn't crazy, it wasn't illogical. It turns out to basically be wrong, although in some interesting ways not entirely wrong for Earth life. But it does make me wonder, is it possible that there could be a Lamarckian system on some other planet? Of course, it would have great advantages. The problem with Darwinian evolution is it's sort of cruel. It depends on lots and lots, as my colleague Steve Benner, who's written about this issue, says it depends on lots and lots of kids dying of genetic diseases, which nobody thinks is a good thing, but strictly with Darwinian evolution, that's how life works and improves itself and even maintains itself in an environment. So, there's nothing necessarily morally superior about Darwinian evolution. It's just that that's the way life works on Earth, pretty much. So it was reasonable to suppose, but that was before we knew about genetics and before we knew about molecular biology, and especially this stuff, DNA, which is the sort of miracle molecule that divides itself and passes on the information about how to make organisms. In life on Earth, to put it very sort of crudely, but basically correctly, life depends on DNA and proteins. DNA passes on the information. DNA cannot replicate without proteins mediating that replication process in all kinds of ways. But proteins, which are the polymers that both regulate all the chemical reactions in our cell and our metabolism and build a lot of the structures of life, proteins cannot form without DNA. Neither one can form without the other, which forms a weird kind of chicken and egg problem thinking about the origin of life. It's hard to think about the definition of life without thinking about the origin of life, because historically it was the question, how is living matter different is living matter different in some essential way from non-living matter? And before we knew about organic molecules and genes, it was very much an open question. Now, given what we've learned, we realize that living matter is made out of the same stuff, of course, as non-living matter, but it's a process that somehow differentiates the two. Thinking about the origin of life, though, we are stuck with this problem. We have this system that depends on two kinds of molecules, each of which cannot function, cannot form without the other. So one possible answer to this question is famously called by scientists RNA World. And RNA World, the idea was made especially promising, plausible, by a discovery in 1989 that won Tom Cech a Nobel Prize of a kind of chemical called ribozymes, which are RNA molecules. Nucleic acids basically almost the same as DNA. You either know the difference between the two, or you'll accept from me right now that it's not that important for the purposes of this discussion. But nucleic acids, like DNA, but they're RNA, that can both catalyze organic chemical reactions, like proteins, but also hold information, like nucleic acids. So these chemicals potentially can do it all, both the heredity and the catalysis, the synthesis of other molecules. So it may be, and this is a popular, unproven, but sort of supported by a lot of experimental and other data, that life may have started out as these sort of naked replicators, molecules that could replicate themselves and also catalyze the reactions that helped them to survive. And ribozymes, life may have started out as these ribozymes multiplying and evolving in an RNA world. Well, an interesting point about that, I think, is that if this is the case, then life actually started out Lamarckian, in that if you're a naked replicator and your body, you're one of these molecules, try to put yourself in the mindset of a naked replicator. Your body is the molecule that contains your heredity. Then, in a sense, anything that happens to you that allows you to evolve and improve your fitness is an acquired characteristic. You're inheriting acquired characteristic. So life, if we are correct that life started out as an RNA world, life actually started out Lamarckian and became Darwinian when the genotype and phenotype became separate. In other words, when we, meaning our ancient slimy ancestors, evolved this system of different molecules for the heredity and the metabolism. So the earliest stages of life may, in that sense, have been non-Darwinian. And an interesting point is that life may again be becoming, some people perhaps think has become, in a certain sense, non-Darwinian, in that cultural evolution, of course, in a lot of practical aspects for what's changing our world, is dominant. And cultural evolution is Lamarckian. Right? It's not passed down by genes. You learn things, you teach them to the next generation. It has nothing to do with your genes. You're passing on acquired characteristics. Furthermore, genetic engineering, and some people think that the future of life, or what comes from life, and again we're getting into definition questions, may even ultimately have to do more with machine evolution. These things that are here and maybe around the corner, maybe not. But these are obviously, that should say non-Darwinian. There's a non-helpful mutation in my slide here. Are they Lamarckian? I don't know, because this I would not even call inheritance of acquired so much as inheritance of desired characteristics. But at any rate, looked at like this, one might even see the history of life on Earth as starting out Lamarckian, being characterized by a long and fruitful Darwinian period, and then perhaps in some way becoming post-Darwinian, maybe even Lamarckian again. I don't want to dwell on this too long, but when thinking of generalizing the problem of life in the universe and what it is that we're looking for, I'm not 100% sure that the assumption that it has to be Darwinian is ironclad. I still think it's a very useful thing to look for. So life is hard to define. There is no perfect, universally accepted definition. One reasonable approach is, ironically, to use something like the legal definition of pornography, which in this case in 1964, a judge basically said, well, different communities define it different ways. We're just going to say that people know it when they see it. And that's actually an accepted legal definition. And in a certain sense, that may be, for now, the best approach to use with life, keeping in mind all these conflicting, not completely compatible definitions. But in other words, we need to keep a fluid definition and do this strange exercise of searching for something that we can't completely define. And ironically, we won't be able to define until we find other examples of it and move beyond this fact that we only have one example. So it's a bit of a paradox, but I don't think it's enough of a paradox to prevent us from doing useful exploration and useful science. Now, I have to make a brief aside to point out that biology is not the only field that has trouble defining its subject matter. Somewhat embarrassingly, my own field of planetary science cannot agree on a definition of planet and has made some fairly public blunders about this in recent years, centering around this supposed redefinition of Pluto as not being a planet. Now, Pluto may or may not be a planet. It depends on what definition you adopt. But at least one ought to have a decent definition of planet. And the problem is that the definition adopted by the IAU, the International Astronomical Union, and I won't go through all of this, but it's not a good definition. In fact, it's a pretty bad one for a couple of reasons. One is that they define planet as something that is in orbit around the sun. At a time when we are going through this revolutionary gaining of knowledge of planets and have learned in this decade that most of the planets we know of are no longer in our solar system, and we're trying to teach kids the excitement and importance of that, it's really stupid. Sorry, any of you that are members of the IAU Committee on Nomenclature. It's really stupid, or perhaps unwise, I should say, at least, to define a planet as something that has to be in orbit around the sun. The other problem is that the difference between a planet and what they decided was a dwarf planet is something that has not cleared the neighborhood around its orbit. It is not a very well-defined term, and even worse, it's something we cannot determine for the new planets or planet-like objects being discovered around other stars. In order to determine that, you have to know the small body population in the neighborhood of a candidate planet. We will never, I can't say never, but I shouldn't, but for quite a long time, it's hard enough to detect the planets. To know if they're surrounded by a swarm of small bodies will be very, very difficult. So I think picking a definition where all of these exoplanets are in reality not known to be planets or not, it's just, I could go on and on. I don't like this definition. I think it was very sloppy, and you know, kids come to our museum and they ask what's happened to poor Pluto, and I have to say nothing, don't worry, Pluto's fine. It's just a bunch of silly astronomers who can't quite agree on what words mean. And so you try to use that as a teachable moment about the culture of science. And they also defined that a dwarf planet is not a planet, and so there's some linguistic weirdness to it. In fact, I don't want to go on and on about this, but this one linguist pointed out that this is really ad hoc since it applies to our own solar system. It's like a biologist saying that mammals are something that exists only in North America, and it just wasn't handled too well. I think it will be overturned. I don't know what the fate of Pluto will be, but I think we'll eventually settle. It's an easier problem to define planets than to define life. Much easier. It just hasn't been done yet in an official way. A couple more slides, and then I promise I'll leave this topic. But so how many planets are there? Are there 9? Are there 12? Are there 8? Well, I think if Carl Sagan were alive today and we asked him this question, he would say there are billions and billions. Because in reality, there are. That should be the big message that people are getting. That, you know, the good news for modern man is that there are, we now know, roughly at least as many planets in the galaxy as there are stars. So when you look up at a starry night, you're seeing, even though you can't see them with your naked eye, as many planets as there are stars. And so in terms of thinking about life, that's wonderful, because even a phenomena that only occurs rarely, if there are enough trials, enough experiments, then you can still have a positive result. So, and the other sort of silly thing about this is that one of the arguments was that we shouldn't tell the kids that there are more than 9 planets because it will confuse them. They can't memorize that many. But anybody who's ever worked with kids and talk to them about dinosaurs and thinks there's a limit to numbers of things they can memorize if they're interested in the subject matter, you shouldn't worry about that. Okay, so who gives a darn anyways? Is it important? It's not really important to define planets well, because it's not going to really affect the science we do, the exploration we do. It's just, we know enough what they are. They're big things that are orbiting stars, and we're interested in finding them, and some of them we'll call one category, but we're not going to sort of miss something important because our definition of planets is wrong. In fact, we have a spaceship right now called New Horizons, which is on its way to Pluto. Here's the launch in January 2006. It's more than halfway there now. It'll get there in July of 2015, and Pluto will certainly look like a planet, I predict, and I think that this whole brouhaha will be, whether we like it or not, revisited at that time. But at any rate, we still, let me return now to what is life. We, forget what is a planet, it's mired in the muck. But with life, does it matter that we don't have a definition that's good? Well, it might. Because we don't want to miss something important, because we're looking for the wrong thing. But certainly, in the absence of a definition and in the absence of a tricorder, we can at least somewhat more pragmatically search for 2 different categories of phenomena. One is just looking for habitable conditions, finding the places that, according to our understanding, our evolving understanding, life needs. That what kinds of environments do we believe supports life? And I think we can say some pretty reasonable things about this, even not being able to say what life is. And we can also look for life signs, not in the Spockian sense, but in the sense of asking what does life do to its environment? And again, I think there are some things that are pretty reasonable, that reasonable minds can agree upon to answer both these questions. What does life need? Well, people have put together different lists. They're different in the details, but they all involve some kind of chemical disequilibrium, and you could say more specifically food and electron acceptors, but basically chemicals that can exchange electrons, either donating them or accepting them, and thereby in these redox reactions liberating energy that can be used for metabolism. So I could simplify this whole part by saying life needs an energy source. Life, at least life as we know it, needs a carbon source, needs some access to the biogenic elements. We can argue what those elements strictly are, but on Earth they're nitrogen, phosphorus, oxygen. Sulfur seems to be missing from this list, but we can put together a small list of some subset of the periodic table that seems to be necessary. And liquid water. Now, this is life as we know it, and I'll get back to the question of can we come up with more broad definitions. But even to look for life as we know it, we have to come up with some agreed upon list. And the punchline from this is that most of these things are pretty common in the universe. There are energy sources very widely distributed. There are carbon sources we now know in interstellar dust, in meteorites and comets, on most planets. Carbon doesn't really seem to be a problem. There are biogenic elements very widely distributed. A lot of the most important biogenic elements are among the most common elements in the universe. So we tend to focus on liquid water because whether or not you think that this model of life as we know it is right, it's even harder, it's very hard to come up with a model of life that doesn't depend on a liquid medium. Because things frozen in solids, or you can't imagine the kind of interaction molecules that you need, and things in gases, you just don't have the stability of structure. A liquid creates this nice intermediate stage where there's flexibility but enough stability. And so our search for habitable environments has tended to focus on liquid water. I'll try in a few minutes to offer a potential alternative criteria. What about signs of life? Can we identify some things that life does to its environment, even if we can't strictly say that we know how to identify life itself? Well, there's been a lot of focus on the idea of disequilibrium. Life perturbs its environment. It perturbs the chemistry of its environment. Earth's atmosphere is really different from the atmospheres of other planets. And it's different because living organisms over time have perturbed it radically. And this is from a slide by James Lovelock, the founder of the Gaia hypothesis. I'll return to him in a minute too. But for instance, if you look at the atmospheres of Venus and Mars and a dead Earth you can model, they're all pretty similar. It's mostly CO2. But Earth is anomalous. It has all this oxygen and a certain amount of methane that are the result of biologic activity and are unlikely and unstable. If you took the life away from Earth, this arrangement would not last long. Life maintains this unusual atmosphere, and it has been suggested, and there are some pretty, I think, compelling and deep arguments for why this may be true, that this could be a universal indicator of life. And it's very useful for those of us thinking of all those planets around other stars, which are going to be very hard to investigate up close, but we can imagine building instruments that can tell us what their atmospheres are made out of. So if you could really come up with a convincing criterion for habitability or habitation that uses something like this, then you might be onto something. Now, interestingly, Mars has recently been found to have a little bit of methane, which has been interpreted by some as a life sign on Mars. And there's now some controversy about whether the methane is really there. But the reason why people got so excited is that methane should not exist on Mars if it gets destroyed very rapidly by photochemistry and by other chemistry. So if it's there, something is supplying it now in an ongoing way. And one of the things, the main thing on Earth that supplies methane to the atmosphere is life. So people have imagined that maybe there's buried life on Mars and underground hot springs, which probably do exist somewhere. This is the whole story. But the reason why this methane on Mars is potentially so exciting, if it's really there for astrobiology, is because of this. It's a signature of chemical disequilibrium, anomalous disequilibrium. It really ought to say anomalous disequilibrium because all atmospheres have some kind of disequilibrium, but if it's really out of whack, and I think Earth's atmosphere can be described as really out of whack, really flagrantly deviating from equilibrium because of life, then maybe that's something that we could look for elsewhere. Another, I think, very clever life sign has been identified by Chris McKay from NASA Ames, and he calls this the Lego principle. He points out that life uses a discrete set of small molecules, organic molecules, as basic building blocks to make larger molecules. And as a result of that, if you analyze some living matter as opposed to non-living, even non-living organic matter, you find a very different distribution of molecular weights and of molecular types than you would as a result of some random process that's not amplifying the existence of certain molecules. And this is his sort of cartoon to describe that. In an abiotic, you have a very smooth distribution, and in a biological system, you tend to amplify certain molecules. And what's nice about this is that it allows you to look for something without saying it has to work exactly the way our life has to work. If it has this general principle of sort of modular construction like Legos, then you might be able to identify life. So that's a potential life sign that doesn't depend on life using the same biochemistry that we do. There's also this business of chirality that on Earth, for reasons of just natural selection and the way biochemistry works, there's a handedness to certain organic molecules. That is, this is an amino acid, and you can have a left-handed or a right-handed version, depending on the way things are put together. Just like your two hands, you can't superimpose them. They're mirror symmetry. There are mirror symmetries to molecules too, and it's suggested that this selectivity on Earth, all the amino acids of your proteins and proteins of all life are left-handed, not right-handed. And that, again, if you found strong chirality or handedness, then that might be a clue that doesn't depend on things working exactly the way we work. There's actually been one experiment, one spacecraft that specifically went to another planet to search for life. There have been a lot of spacecraft that have been motivated in a larger sense by this search for life, but also other scientific questions. But the Viking landers in 1976 carried this package of biological experiments. It's one of the most complex and expensive 1.5 cubic foot machines ever devised. It has valves and ovens and incubators, and it's really an impressive little machine. And one of the 3 experiments was called the labeled release experiment. And the idea basically was that you took what were considered nutrients, likely nutrients for possible Martians to want to eat. Raises all kinds of other interesting questions. But nutrients labeled with radioactive carbon, and you put it in the Martian soil and look at the gases that, if any gases are released, and what they're like. And the idea is that if you release labeled CO2, then maybe that means there's something that's eating that stuff and exhaling CO2. And the interesting thing is that when you do this, you produce tons of labeled CO2 very vigorously. And this was the criteria that before the spacecraft was sent was defined as a successful detection of life. So according to the pre-agreed criteria, this experiment detected life on Mars. But it's almost universally believed among astrobiologists and people that know about this that this experiment did not detect life on Mars. Because, for a couple reasons. The pattern of release was very much like a chemical getting used up and then being exhausted. It furiously boiled off the stuff at the beginning and then quickly died off. And furthermore, there was another experiment on board the spacecraft, the GCMS, the gas chromatograph mass spectrometer, that looked for organic molecules, and it found none down to parts per billion levels. It's remarkably devoid of organic molecules, the Martian topsoil. And so for this reason, there's an alternative explanation that's favored for this positive result of a life detection experiment, which is that there were strong oxidants in the Martian soil produced by ultraviolet light interacting with molecules in the atmosphere that permeate this soil and both destroy organic molecules and react strongly with any organic molecules that you put there and release labeled CO2. That's the accepted explanation. Now, this one response to this is a suggestion that I think is quite clever by a scientist named Lin Chow, who he wrote this nice essay called The Meaning of Life. I love these non-grandiose titles. But he proposed that you could send something, and I like this, and I'll spend a moment on it, because it's an experiment that actually tests for the existence of Darwinian life, of life that's evolving by Darwinian processes, which is kind of an interesting thing that you could go and test. And what he does is he says, look, first if you did the labeled release experiment and you just took the results from one and you diluted that sample and put it in another flask and did it again and diluted that and did it again, if it was just a chemical reaction, it would get more and more dilute every time, and it would go like this over time as far as the amount of gas released. If in fact it was bugs that were reproducing themselves, then you might expect it to look like this over time, because if you gave them some time, they would reproduce and it would not diminish. And then he points out that in fact you can make Darwinian evolution happen in a flask on Earth. If you take E. coli in a flask and you do the same kind of thing where you take some subset and put them in another flask and take some subset in another flask and look at how they do, their performance judged by their ability to just survive and reproduce, it goes up over time. Random mutations lead them to increase their ability to survive in this environment. So you can make things evolve in flasks. So then he said, well, if you did that on Mars and you did the same kind of thing and they were actually evolving and improving their ability to do this, then you might see the amount of gas released over time increase. I don't know how practical it is to actually go and do this, but I just liked the idea that somebody said, hey, we can design an experiment to look and see if this stuff is Darwinian. Okay, so quickly now I want to lead you through some places in the solar system and how we think about looking for life in these places. Mars, I'm not going to talk about for long because every talk about looking for life is about Mars. And Mars is an interesting place to look for past life. Mars has fascinated us over time and given us visions of Martians, I think, that persist, regardless of what we actually discover about Mars. I think my idea about that is because we can actually see things changing on the surface of Mars, even through a backyard telescope, which is not true about any other planet, that you can just look up a telescope night after night, season after season, and see these markings change and the polar caps grow and shrink. So Mars has this animated quality to it, and it's also nearby, and it's the god of war, and it's juicy source for science fiction. As we explore Mars, we find that the current surface conditions are not very hospitable for life as we know it. It's cold, it's bathed in radiation, there's no water, there's almost no air. But we see so much evidence for past conditions on Mars that are consistent with the evolution and maintenance of life at one point. As far as we can tell, Mars, when it was young, was a similar environment to Earth when it was young. There was probably liquid water. The closer we look, the more signs we see. River deltas, rivers that have meandered and spilled their banks requiring sustained flow, not just floods. There was probably rainfall. There had to be a thicker atmosphere, warmer, wetter. It may not have been a bad environment. But that's just from orbit. Can we get ground truth? Well, we've gone there with these rovers. We go up to the rocks. We scratch and sniff them. We ask them to tell us their stories. And what do the rocks say to us? They say, go home. No, not really. It's photoshopped. But remarkably, the rocks we have found on Mars with the rovers confirm this story. These are layered sediments with a mineral called jarosite, a sulfur-rich mineral that, as far as we can tell, had to be deposited in an aqueous environment. They were laid down in the presence of water a long time ago, billions of years ago on Mars. But this ground truth now confirms the idea that Mars is a place where the origin of life could have at least happened at once. In my view, the idea of finding life on Mars today is really a long shot, but the idea of finding fossils on Mars, or at least fossil evidence of some kind of early biological evolution, is not outrageous. And in fact, we're sending another rover there that's going, the Mars Science Laboratory, or the Curiosity rover, is going to launch this November, and it's designed to kind of go the next step and do more sophisticated chemical experiments and see if we can follow the trail of possible organic evolution on early Mars. Now, moving quickly, the other place that is most commonly talked about for life as we know it in the solar system is Europa. And Europa is a moon of Jupiter that tantalizingly seems to have a liquid water ocean beneath its fractured ice crust. And there's a lot of pretty good evidence that there really is perhaps our solar system's largest liquid water ocean. Even more water than all the oceans of Earth may reside between this relatively thin, and by which I mean tens to maybe 100 kilometers, of ice on Europa. So Europa has sources of organic matter in the form of comets and asteroids that fall on the ice and work their way into the interior. There's good reasons to believe it formed with a lot of organic matter. It has energy sources. It probably has water. If our current understanding of what it takes to make life as we know it is correct, then there should be life on Europa. So it's a tantalizing possibility. Unfortunately, it's hard to explore the ocean of Europa. It's hard to get there, it's hard to land, and then you have to melt your way through tens of kilometers of ice. It's not an easy problem. It's something we will do at some point. But is there any other way to search for life? I want to move on for a moment beyond the common targets of Mars and Europa, places where we're basically looking for liquid water, our kind of life, and ask are there any other criteria we might try to use to look for life in a broader sense in other kinds of environments? And let's go back for a second to the question of what is life. There are other kinds of answers that have been proposed and focused on a little bit more recently. The living systems theory, which is basically an attempt to look at general principles, not just of what organisms are, but of what living systems are, the way organisms interact with their environments. And instead of breaking things down in their component parts and worrying about weird questions like, well, you're alive, but are your individual cells alive? Well, maybe, but are the individual molecules inside them alive? Probably not. And then you can go the other direction and talk about superorganisms and ecologies. But rather than worry about that, look at the phenomena in terms of the dynamic patterns and the relationships with their environment. And one famous application of this has been called Gaia theory. Now, Gaia theory has sometimes a suspect rap in scientific circles because it's been adopted by New Age people to talk about all kinds of, New Age things. But the idea of thinking of a global ecosystem as having properties of life that may not be reducible to smaller qualities, I think is an interesting and scientifically useful concept when we think about looking for life elsewhere. It may be that a planet with life has global properties that distinguish it from a planet without life, that is beyond what you would find with just sort of a dead world with some scattered organisms on it. And so this is something I've explored a little bit, and in a book I wrote a few years ago called Lonely Planets, I talked about something that we might call the living worlds hypothesis as an alternative criteria. The typical approach is to look for physical conditions which overlap those on Earth. We look for places that are like this room. It's nice and warm, there's water, and we can live. But is there any way, the problem with that is it may again be that we're sort of just looking for ourselves out there. Can we do better? Well, I don't know, but you can think of life as maybe a planetary scale phenomenon with a cosmological lifespan. The only inhabited world we know has these qualities, that life has deeply permeated all of its physical realms. It requires internally driven geological activity. It has an atmosphere in flagrant chemical disequilibrium. And it may be that habitability is not just about, in a passive sense, a climate with where liquid water is possible, but this kind of vigorous geological and chemical activity of which life becomes a part, and that if we think of the biosphere as the unit that's important, then life is something that has a cosmological lifespan. It's existed for billions of years and sort of morphed in various ways. It's a subtle point, but I think when we apply it to other planets, it's interesting because then we're not just looking for our kind of chemistry and liquid water, but we're thinking of these global thermodynamic properties. And are there other places in our solar system, not to mention all the planets beyond, that then become interesting when we think of this point of view? Well, one of my favorite places to think of life on, in a sort of devil's advocate way, is Venus, our sister planet, the planet right next door. Now, there's no way you could have life as we know it on the surface of Venus. It's really hot. Proteins would denature in an instant. You would cook faster than you could say the word cook. So forget it. But interestingly, in the clouds of Venus, there are realms where it is about the surface temperature and surface pressure of Earth. Not only that, but there are energy sources, there are biogenic elements, and there's even liquid water, albeit in the form of concentrated sulfuric acid, which is what the clouds are made out of. But concentrated sulfuric acid is water with stuff dissolved in it. And I like to point out to astrobiologists that there is a plausibility argument that can be made that all the requirements of life are met in the clouds of Venus. And I've published a paper about this. I don't have time to really go into it in detail, but if anybody's interested, some friends and I published a paper in the journal Astrobiology where we made this argument and talked about the kind of chemistry that life might use there. and answered some of the possible objections and compared it to the survival strategies of organisms on Earth, etc. So I think it's a useful thing for astrobiology to consider the possibility of life in unorthodox environments, if only to sort of test our ideas and make sure we're not being too geocentric in our thinking. The major objections to this are, why aren't the clouds green on Earth? Life on Earth is so opportunistic. Why don't we see it in clouds? I think there's a decent answer that the clouds of Venus are continuous and calm, and they're like the ocean of Venus. They just sort of sit there, and clouds on Earth are so ephemeral, and they come and go, and they're not continuous, that I think it might be actually much harder to maintain a microbial community. And of course, the clouds are strong acid. There's a high ultraviolet flux. Well, I'm not particularly worried about the last two. Well, for one thing, life on clouds has been found on Earth, not just passively being carried by the winds, but there's this group in Austria claims they've caught bacteria in the act of reproducing in cloud particles. Needs to be confirmed. The experiments themselves need to be reproduced just as much as the organisms need to reproduce, but it's an interesting possibility. Furthermore, the acid objection is not as strong as it used to be because we keep finding extremophiles on Earth, and the low pH limit of terrestrial life is not known. This is the Cueva de la Luz in Mexico, which is such strong acid the investigators have to wear gloves or they would really hurt themselves, and the place is brimming with microbial life that loves sulfuric acid. And so we don't really know how far we can push life in this direction, but I think it's safe to say that we can't rule out that kind of extremophile life. So life on Venus, who knows? One last place I just have to mention, and that is Titan, the icy moon of Saturn, which is one of the most fascinating objects of current exploration. We have a mission called Cassini, which is currently in orbit around Titan. And Titan has been very enigmatic because when you look at it from space, all you see is this orange ball. The reason why it's an orange ball is that this atmosphere, which, by the way, it's a weird place in a lot of ways, and it's the only moon in the solar system with a thick atmosphere, thicker even than Earth's atmosphere. It's about 1.5 bars of pressure at the surface of Titan. But this atmosphere is full of a thick, photochemically generated haze of organic molecules. And the organic molecules are reacting in the presence of sunlight to make more complex organic molecules. We don't know how complex, but we do know there's a lot of interesting organic chemistry going on Titan. Cassini has shown us that the surface is varied. There's a kind of hydrological cycle going on there, although it's methane. We have methane lakes, methane rainfall, methane rivers. There's a lot of interesting things going on there that are analogous to what's going on Earth with different materials. And one can't help but wonder, could life possibly be something going on there analogous to Earth in this very thermodynamically rich environment with flows and energy sources and transformations, but using different materials? This is just a radar image showing one of the many lakes that we've now discovered, which are lakes of methane and ethane, and even spectacularly the Huygens probe, which was carried with Cassini and which descended to enter and land on the surface of Titan, took these pictures of what can only be called rivers. So there are rivers on Titan too. But what's really going on with the organic molecules? Well, there's a lot of theory and experiments on this, and I won't dwell on it. But basically, the methane is broken up photochemically, and there's a lot of different pathways. But it does lead to these complex polymers, including things like polyacetylenes, that form this haze and fall on the surface. Nitrogen is also being broken up by the energetic electrons, mostly, that come from the acceleration of Saturn's strong magnetic field. And that's really interesting in terms of biochemistry, or prebiotic chemistry at least, because nitrogen-containing organic molecules, you get things like nitriles, amino acids, the kind of stuff that, as astrobiologists thinking about organic matter and its possible complexity elsewhere in the universe, we're interested in nitrogen-containing organic molecules. So that stuff exists on Titan. What's it doing there? Who knows? The main problem with Titan and the possibility of life is it's so darn cold. but are there microenvironments where that could be overcome? So this is just a cartoon. You have the photochemical haze, you have methane clouds, methane rainfall, and perhaps places where acetylene and other energy-rich compounds are being concentrated and maybe even interacting with liquid water. We know that liquid water occasionally does spill out on the surface of Titan because we see cryovolcanoes. So they're geological heat sources that are melting all that water ice and occasionally leading to flows of liquid water, probably mixed with ammonia antifreeze. So again, in the spirit of sort of devil's advocate, my colleague Dirk Schulze-McCouch, who's at the Washington State University, he and I wrote a paper and published it in Astrobiology about the question of life on Titan and what would it be doing if there was life on Titan, what would it use to power its metabolism, and what might its observable effects be. And very briefly, we talked about the fact that with all that acetylene on the surface, which is we know is raining out of the sky, that's actually quite an energy source. And there is molecular hydrogen. If you could somehow react that acetylene with the molecular hydrogen in the atmosphere, the back reaction to make methane is exothermic. And this stuff is all over the surface. So there is food on Titan. If anything had evolved to take advantage, there is available metabolic energy. And the beauty of this is that it's a kind of photosynthetic life, you could imagine, but the photons are being absorbed in the upper atmosphere, and then the energy-rich molecules are raining down on the surface where the photons don't reach, and something is potentially eating them and liberating that methane, which goes back into the upper atmosphere and gets photolyzed to make more of this stuff. So it's a weird kind of cycle that's kind of fun to imagine. It would certainly release a lot of energy. It solves another problem. Methane is unstable in Titan's atmosphere, and yet the atmosphere is 5% methane. So strictly applying these criteria of looking for anomalous atmospheres, you have to look at Titan and go, wait a minute, is there something alive there? Now, that's not the accepted community response, because appropriately people are very conservative about attributing biology to planets, and they look for the more mundane explanation, like Carl Sagan said, and other people have said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But it's interesting to point out that if there was this kind of metabolism going on Titan, it does solve the methane problem. It releases a lot of energy, and I can't help but wonder if there were these kinds of organisms on Titan, if they might be partly solving the cold problem, which is the big problem of biology on Titan, by using some of the energy to melt their own little watering holes. We think of efficiency of an organism as something to be maximized. Waste heat is bad. But in an environment where there's lots of chemical energy and your biggest problem is that it's really cold and you need to melt a watering hole, the evolutionary pressure might be to reduce your efficiency and make lots of waste heat, because it wouldn't be waste heat, it would be allowing you to survive. And so the fun thing with astrobiology is you can look for terrestrial analogies, and in fact there are terrestrial analogies, there are terrestrial analogs, there are organisms on Earth that use heat to help themselves. And my favorite example is the skunk cabbage, which is weird. It's kind of a warm-blooded plant. It can raise its internal temperature to 20 degrees above the ambient temperature, and part of its life cycle is that it melts its way through the ice so that it can reach the sunlight. So a crude analogy, but at least demonstrating the principle that life can use biothermal heating to help itself. So how do we evaluate potential atmospheric signatures of life? Many atmospheric anomalies could potentially be explained by either biological or non-biological means. We have the methane on Mars. We have this obvious amount of methane in Titan staring us in the face that people assume is not biological, but I sometimes wonder if we can rule that out yet until we learn more about Titan. Well, you have to make other predictions. So an acetylene-fueled biosphere on Titan would predict a hydrogen flux downward into the surface, and it would predict missing acetylene on the surface. Not to go into too much detail, but interestingly, both of these have recently been observed. There is a hydrogen flux that's currently unexplained that I'm not going to explain this graph now because I just don't have time, but if you're interested in this, please ask me. I can send you a reprint. We can talk about it more. But there is a recent result suggesting missing hydrogen at the surface of Titan. And there is also a recently published result that the acetylene, which ought to be there on Titan, according to all our understanding of what's going on in the atmosphere and the chemistry of the surface, is missing on the surface of Titan. Now, I do not claim that this is evidence for life on Titan. Quite the contrary. I propose this idea because I think exploring the plausibility of life in these environments is useful to our thinking non-geocentrically. If you had to ask me, I'd say probably there's not life on Titan. There's probably another explanation. But I think it's intriguing, worthy of more exploration and thought. And you know, we can ask which of these two statements is truly universal. Life needs liquid water, or life simply finds a way to exploit persistent available energy in disequilibrium. And I think we don't yet know, but I maintain that until we understand things on Titan more, that the biogenic origin of the methane is still possible. And finally, I'd like to end by saying that the way that we answer these questions, we can hypothesize all we want, but the way we really make breakthroughs and learn about life elsewhere and about what's going on other planets is through exploration. And I'm happy to report that exploration goes on. In fact, one of the missions recently selected by NASA, one of 3 missions for further study, a year of further study for the selection for the next Discovery mission, which is what NASA calls their relatively low-class missions. One of these missions is, I think, a really cool idea, that it would basically land a boat on Titan in one of these lakes and analyze the chemistry and look in more detail at what's going on there. So whether we could really pull this off on the kind of budget they're talking about is something that's being actively looked at now, but at least it's in the running this time. It's called TIME, this mission, to go and do the first nautical exploration of an extraterrestrial sea. And finally, I would be remiss in not pointing out that we are also actively on the trail of lots and lots of other planets in the form of the remarkable revolution that's going on now in the discovery of exoplanets. As I mentioned in the introduction, we now know of more planets outside our solar system than planets within our solar system. This great spacecraft called Kepler is up there now looking for the transits, the sign of planets passing in front of other stars out in the constellation Perseus in our galaxy, and it's finding them. And so we're just on the edge of knowing, if I came back a year from now and spoke to you, I'd be able to say, here's how many Earth-like planets there are in our galaxy. We're just on the edge of knowing that. And so given that, this idea of being able to start to characterize them and have a lot more planets to play with intellectually and start to both refine our ideas of life and then hopefully find it and come up with a definition that is actually based on more than one example. I don't think the prospects are hopeless. And the journey towards this knowledge is a fruitful one, even in the absence of a definite detection of extraterrestrial life. So all we can do is keep looking up with the tools we have at hand, and that's it. Thank you very much.
So there are kind of 2 parallel searches going on. One that you described here, and the other one is search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And so this search doesn't presume intelligence. It's a biomolecular one. Study, not necessarily biomolecular. What's the thinking on connecting the dots between those 2 things?
Yeah, great question. I didn't mention SETI, because as you can see, I had more to mention than I had time for anyways. But the other approach is to assume that in some subset of the places where life has evolved, it's gotten to the point that we've gotten to, and maybe beyond, where it's doing science and maybe even sending and looking for signals and trying to communicate. And again, the numbers are such that even if this has happened in a small subset, one can imagine with a big galaxy that that's not a completely ridiculous thing to think about. And if we were able to succeed, it would of course be more important than we can probably even imagine. So how do you connect the dots? Well, it's an interesting question. Again, looking for intelligent life, I mean, how do you recognize a signal? And how do you distinguish that from noise? And some of the theory is similar in terms of looking for ordered structures as opposed to random structures. But then, some of the theory involves trying to think of what is possibly universally the product of mind. And people have talked about things like prime numbers in message construction and message deconstruction, because prime numbers, as far as we know, are we can't find a natural process that produces them. There's also this idea of looking for artifacts. How would you recognize artifacts? And Carl Sagan used to talk about looking for mechanical disequilibrium. He used a picture of Stonehenge. If you find something that's a really unlikely structure, maybe it happens once. If you find a pattern of them, you have to wonder how it got there. And in some ways, it mirrors this idea of Schrodinger of looking for anomalous order. The artifacts probably, there's some theory about how artifacts would differ from the, in some generic way that's not dependent on our particular technology from the objects of more, quote, natural processes. And this idea of mechanical disequilibrium is one that's often discussed.
What's the effect of gravity on DNA? Higher gravities or lower gravities?
Not much, because the scale of molecules is such that their intramolecular forces, if you're an atom in a DNA molecule, you're much more worried about the tugs and pulls of the polarity and the different charges than it would take an extraordinary gravitational field to really affect DNA. Gravity affects life on other scales, but I think the molecular scale, you're pretty safe. Of course, if you're in space, you're worried about other things. You're worried about cosmic rays and things that do affect molecules.
Is there a certain length at which gravity then does have an effect? For instance, 200 base pairs, 3,000 base pairs. Is there a certain level that then it will take effect?
Well, there's certainly characteristic scales at which gravity becomes more of an issue in various phenomena. My strong sense is that at the scale of macromolecules, you're just not going to get to that size. Yeah.
I invite everyone who is interested to speak to David right after this. We'll call this to an end now. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.